Dr. Martin Brueckner serves as the director of the Winterthur Program in American Material Culture and specializes in American literature, history, and culture before 1900. The former co-director of the Center for Material Culture Studies and the Delaware Public Humanities Institute, he also serves as co-editor of the book series Material Culture Perspectives, published by the University of Delaware Press. He is the author of 2 award-winning books, The Social Life of Maps in America, 1750 to 1860, and The Geographic Revolution in Early America, Maps, Literacy, and National Identity.
I wait till people are settling in, and as Ron was talking, I did some math in the back of my mind. There's 300 poles to 3,300 feet. It's almost, I think, as if they were using metrics in a weird way, because 3,300 feet is almost a kilometer, a little bit more, like 1,000 meters. So I keep wondering, were they already using metrics in a way that we didn't even realize? And the other measurement that I keep tripping over is the size of the map, right? 44 square feet. That's about the size of a queen bed. So if you want to have yet another frame of reference, imagine you're settling in your queen-size bed, and that's the map. So that gives you like 2 more different frames of reference. So thank you very much for having me here today and talk to you my version of the Virginia map, the Bowie map. You will discover that without Ron and me actually coordinating, there is a little bit of overlap, because we probably came at this from the very same perspective, namely, what on earth are state maps doing in 1826? And so that was also my kind of starting point. And thank you so much, Cassandra, or I realized Sandy, I didn't know that. Cassandra, for inviting me and for launching this amazing event today. But let me begin. And I begin by taking you back in time to the moment when Virginians were invited for the first time to lay eyes on the Bowie map. It was in May 1826 that 3 printed copies were made available for public inspection at Richmond's office of the Second Auditor. A puff piece published in the Richmond Enquirer prepared visitors for the map encounter. We learned that the map is engraved on 9 different plates and is of the largest size. Carefully corrected, its counties are laid out in discrete watercolors. It abounds with statistical information, with special tables in the margins, and embellishments at the top exhibit the arms of the Commonwealth, a view of the University of Virginia, and the river landscape of Richmond itself, quote, taken from a spot near the Chinese bridge over the canal, unquote. The author concludes, in a word, we think that the map, tout ensemble, will give universal satisfaction, and then he turns to us, the audience, concluding, in its present state, it is a valuable present to the geographer, the traveler, and the general reader. If you bracket the specialized geographer and the pragmatic traveler, who would soon put the map's accuracy to the test, readers were left with the impression that A, the map is a gift, and B, that this gift is made to the general public. In the early 19th century, there's nothing strange for authors to think of their work as a gift dedicated to the general reader. Practically every book or map launch begged the public to accept the offer and to give approbation, of course for a fee. What is different about the newspaper's boosterism is that it suggests a defensive stance. The map needed to impress the public as much as the scientist or commercial traveler, because this map comes with a historical baggage. The stakes were high when giving public access to the Bowie map in 1826, and at least 3 stakes stand out. First, widely announced, and Ron already mentioned that, as a map of the state of Virginia constructed in conformity to law, the Bowie map was Virginia's first state map officially commissioned by the General Assembly since the founding of the nation. For over 50 years, commercial maps showing Virginia had been mostly defined by non-Virginian authorities or by a very few self-funded amateur map makers. All eyes were now on the map to ensure that the surveyors, engravers, and even printers got everything right in the skeptical eyes of both legislators and their constituents. Second, the public's reaction to the map mattered immensely because, as Cassandra Farrell and her team here at LVA have discovered, this map not only had been enormously expensive, but also expenses were drawn from public funds via state appropriations. Counting everything from the first surveys to the final printing, the sum total for making the Bowie map exceeded $60,000 in 1826, or $1.9 million in today's values. The tax-paying citizens and their elected representatives were not only invited, but self-motivated to inspect what their tax dollars had produced. Finally, and third, what the article in the Richmond Enquirer did not say out loud, but what would have surely been on the public's mind, was that anyone presenting Virginians with a new map had to negotiate the ghosts of Virginia maps past. The Bowie map would inevitably compare itself to iconic historical maps that had shown Virginia first as a colony and then as a state in public and private spaces for over half a century. The first ghosts, and by this I don't mean Charles Dickens's Christmas Tale, but the way in which visual impressions create an after-image that we see when we close our eyes. These first map ghosts date back to the colonial decades. Large maps like the Fry and Jefferson map of Virginia from 1755 here on the left, or John Henry's new and accurate map of Virginia from 1770 on the right, were hung in public offices and taverns, as well as in private studies and parlors, where for Virginians, these maps presented a first and widely available self-image of the province and then future state. For the most part, maps like these were conventional topographical maps, demarcated by terrestrial as well as political boundaries. Mountains to the west, ocean to the east, surveyed borderlines to the north and south, all give shape to the province's cartographic look. It helped that the Fry-Jefferson and the Henry map were large, measuring 38 by 50 inches. They were printed on thick wove paper and distributed in loose sheets for easy assembly as wall maps or as atlas foldouts. These were sturdy maps, and their longevity was put to the test during the Revolutionary War. After 3 years of fighting, American generals experienced a map shortage that put troops at a serious disadvantage. Cut off from British map imports, the Virginia Assembly passed a bill in 1779 appointing 3 persons of learning to requisition maps and atlases from Virginia households. A year later, none other than Thomas Jefferson took it upon himself to find maps showing Virginia's geography. Writing to General Horatio Gates, Jefferson promised, quote, "I have given orders to have Fry and Jefferson's and Henry's maps of Virginia sought for and purchased. As soon as they can be got, I will forward them," unquote. To which he added a few weeks later with the apology, "They are now very scarce." While during the war years, maps of Virginia were a hot, even contraband commodity, after the Revolution, the prevailing map scarcity turned into abundance, creating the second cartographic ghosts haunting the Bowie map. By the mid-1790s, a new generation of map makers popularized the map figure of Virginia when shoehorning images of the state into the bindings of the first national atlases. Seeking to convey both national unity and the autonomy of the individual states, these atlases operated on the assumption that all maps are created equal, meaning small states like Delaware were afforded as much page space when compared to large states like Virginia. The results were bare-boned outline maps, and because engravers fiddled with map scales, at least on paper, all states looked equally large and important. 20 years after making its debut in Cary's American Atlas, the map of Virginia appeared in a second act. Largely unchanged in content, the cartographic outline of Virginia became part of Cary's General Atlas from 1814, designed for businesses, homes, and schools. All maps were re-engraved, many by Henry Tanner, who we'll meet in a few minutes as the engraver of the Bowie map. In the process of printing, however, Cary introduced a coloring standard, with the result that the basic image of Virginia became part of one of the earliest American color plate books and the first American atlas to employ hand coloring. By the time Cary experimented with color in map printing, the American marketplace for domestically produced maps experienced what economists call today the take-off phase. Map prices fluctuated immensely. High-end maps, like the Lewis wall map at the center of this slide, required map makers to either pay all costs out of pocket upfront or to raise funds by subscription. Getting maps into shop windows required map makers to navigate a complex network of labor and material resources. The ledgers show expenses involving draftsmen, engravers, map painters, and printers on one side, and costly copper plates, special map paper, and additional finishing materials, including the wooden dowels that hang for the wall map that's hanging in the exhibition on the other side. By comparison, knockoff reprints using outdated maps were easy to come by and sold for cheap. Before the War of 1812, customers expected to pay for maps anywhere between 12 cents and $22, or between about $2.50 and $320+ in today's value. To put the Cary reprint of his pocket map of Virginia into a different perspective, in circa 1805, a copy of Jefferson's Notes on the State of Virginia would have cost $1.75, while a copy of a picture print, like The View of Philadelphia by William Birch, would only have cost 50 cents. A significant number of maps emerging during the takeoff phase in the early national map-making era were publications that we call today thematic maps. Going clockwise on the slide, Virginians who planned on visiting the sample copies of the Bowie map would have been familiar with the basic image of Virginia from using school atlases and textbooks like Jedediah Morse's American Geography. Other thematic maps included Abram Bradley's map identifying post roads and post offices. The everyday map user would have found the genre of city maps folded into city directories here at the Philadelphia Directory by James Paxton. Or, and some of you will remember the AAA maps before we all had GPS, this is the phase when Americans witnessed the arrival of the modern road atlas, here designed as a strip map that anticipates modern travel planners. One genre of thematic maps that is central to our conversation today, and this is where I'm piggybacking off now of Ron's talk, is the genre of the state map. After the Copyright Act of 1790, which for the first time protected American-made maps, charts, and books, local map makers scrambled to produce definitive maps representing the geography and meaning of their respective home states. Mostly self-funded and thus beholden to public rather than state approval, early state maps were conceived as media events for broadcasting the state's cartographic information while also showcasing state-specific values. Early state maps tended to follow a double design pattern. The actual map content, showing the topography of Massachusetts and New Hampshire, covers only half the sheets. The other half contains a pastiche of different graphic elements. When you think about the Bowie map outside, I think the illustrations actually cover about a quarter of the whole map surface, just to give you kind of a sense of scale here. In the case of the Kerrigan's map of New Hampshire, going from top to bottom, readers find a decorative cartouche with the map title aptly chiseled into a granite rock. Staged like a natural monument, the asymmetrical boulder sits at the center of a visual allegory, celebrating the state's economic base, like the fisheries on the front right, or the first paper mills on the front left, or then the state's infrastructure, here showcased by vignettes of harbors, bridge works, locks, and canals. Below the cartouche, Kerrigan's design stacks insets on top insets, including views of famous landmarks like the White Mountains, statistical tables, and importantly, how the state fits into the nation's larger geography. The nation's fascination with state maps, coupled with a strong sense of state pride, were the factors that informed Virginia's first post-revolutionary mapping project, the 1807 map of Virginia, published by Reverend James Madison, who was then president of College of William Mary, and who also happened to be the first cousin to the president of the same name. And this would be the third ghost that is haunting the Bowie map. A quick look reveals how the Madison map, which was reissued in 1818, fits the commercial parameters I described earlier. The map was self-funded and self-managed. Not trained as a draftsman or surveyor, Madison sponsored the work out of pocket, personally hiring local surveyors and engravers. To recoup his costs early, Madison proposed a subscription scheme 2 years before the actual map was published. In April 1805, he placed ads in the Richmond Enquirer announcing that, quote, the price to subscribers will be $8, neatly mounted, colored, and glazed. Glazed is the same for saying varnished. $1 to lighten the great expense of publication, to be paid on subscribing. But let's keep the focus on the map. Measuring 45 by 69 inches, so maybe like a full-size bed, not a queen-size bed. Measuring 45 by 69 inches, it is intended as a print spectacle. Similar to other state maps of the period, the Madison map leans into the commercial habit of using maps as a versatile media platform. Yes, it is foremost a cartographic representation of the state, showing state lines, county lines, towns, roads, and select buildings. But placed around the actual map image are graphic inserts featuring the neighboring territory of Ohio, explanatory remarks like the map legend, scale and compass, and 2 stylized pictures. A cartouche showing yet another leaning rock formation bearing the national eagle and the map title, and a landscape view of Richmond, the, as it's called, metropolis of Virginia. And if you squint, you can see the State House on the horizon at the center's right. Now, having speedwalked you across 5 decades of Virginia state maps, I now return to our imaginary audience stepping up to the Bowie map put on display in Richmond's auditor's office. If I were to step into the shoes of a map maker working in 1826, I would have been a nervous wreck. Based on past and often vitriolic map reviews, map makers and publishers would have been worried that a fellow surveyor or a seasoned traveler, or worse, some armchair geographer, would discover a mistake. And as it happened to other maps before, I would have been worried that my map was accused of plagiarism for merely copying new and old maps. And since it is 1826, and you know who all died in 1826, founders, the publication of a new map of Virginia would have been compared to several iconic older maps because American audiences had begun to take great antiquarian interest in the collection of national treasures. As a map maker, I would have feared the map connoisseur, the worst of them all, who would question how does my new map stack up against its homegrown predecessors, be it the Fry Jefferson or the more recent Madison map. To the great relief of the map maker Herman Bowie, the map publisher Henry Tanner, and above all the map sponsors, that is, the state officials responsible for funding the project, the new map of Virginia was well received. If we go by the reviews published in newspapers, the map's accuracy was never challenged. Both in size and design were greatly applauded. The literary and evangelical magazine called attention to the map's physical splendor of measuring 8 by 5.5 feet, which made the map, as we now all know, one of the largest state maps produced to date. Or, as the Richmond Enquirer wrote, quote, "The new map of Virginia has never perhaps been surpassed in variety and accuracy of detail or in beauty and elegance of execution," unquote. Today, it is easy for us to dismiss this language as mere stock phrases used in the service of puffery. Going back to the 1820s, it is my experience that keywords like variety, detail, beauty, and elegance were actually code words in connecting the map to a general audience steeped in conversations that were not so much about cartographic accuracy or usefulness, but about artistry, the aesthetics of printed pictures, and the ornamental value of maps. For example, a closer look at the map title reveals how engravers working in the map trade used the map to advertise their own skills. What stands out here is that the ornate lettering and sweeping flourishes are actually the product of the engraver Joseph Perkins, showcasing his talents in letter design used in the construction of trade cards, letterheads, and banknotes. At the center of the map title is a landscape vignette defined by a cartouche that combines 18th with 19th century design patterns. If we study just the center of the cartouche here on the right, we see a heraldic device showing a female figure as Virginia, who with sword and spear in hand has just deposed the figure of a monarch. See the crown and the broken chain. She's framed by a Baroque vine and leaf frame to which is attached a banner that reads Sic semper tyrannis, or to translate, thus always to tyrants, meaning in Virginia, tyrannical leaders will inevitably be overthrown. The framed figure hovers like a painted mirage in a double setting. On her left, we see depicted the by then already world-famous landmark of the Natural Bridge. On the right, we find a romantically inspired landscape view of Harper's Ferry. Both landscapes are a graphic shorthand chosen on purpose to associate the paper map with Virginia's actual geography. But as soon as we realize that the name of the artist is James W. Steele, we enter the early American marketplace of professional engraving and landscape artistry. In 1826, Steele was a rising star in the industry, making a name for himself, specializing in, guess what, landscapes, city views, and yes, also map ornaments. Remember the newspaper's keywords, variety, detail, beauty, and elegance? Phrases like these referred audiences to the map's two other picture inserts. On the right, the view of Richmond from the west, set high above the James River, also engraved by James Steele, and on the left, the view of the University of Virginia. The latter was the creation of Benjamin Tanner, the older brother of the map's principal engraver, Henry Tanner. The landscape view tells the story of a pastoral setting containing neoclassical buildings, bucolic agriculture, and a hint of modern infrastructure shown in the form of a canal. Benjamin Tanner's rendition of the campus echoes 18th century conventions in architectural drawing, emphasizing not only the period-specific Palladian style, but also the vast expanse of the campus lawn, or what other institutions would have called the quad or forum. The image's low density of people may look striking to you, but that was a feature typical for map illustrations. That said, given the fact that Tanner opted to include figures, I'm intrigued by his choices. Two figures, and those are the two top ones, look like they're actually a nod to the surveying project that made the map possible. One figure appears to hold a sextant, or a basic theodolite. The other holds a long staff, typically used by land surveyors for taking measurements. The group of well-dressed figures on the balcony to the right have me wonder if that is a reference to the state's educated citizenry and thus the future buyers of the map. And finally, and this may have to be attributed to the fact that the map is created by artists based in Philadelphia, the figure of a black woman holding a white child is a not so subtle reference to the fact that Virginia's economy and institutions like the university depended on slave labor. On the rare occasion that early newspapers reviews of the Bowie map were not discussing the map's physical scale and visual artistry, they invariably commented on the map as a splendid piece of workmanship. And frequently, they added a special shout-out to its engraver and publisher, Henry Shank Tanner. In 1826, this was not a coincidence. By then, Henry Tanner had beat out the competition for getting the contract of producing the New Virginia map. His relatively low bid of $4,300, still $141,000 a day, was made possible only because since 1823, Tanner had emerged as the nation's best-known map publisher. He was famous for running a model geographical establishment capable of producing map giants next to miniature maps and always using the most up-to-date information. A few years after the Bowie map, a site visit by a reporter of the National Gazette explains Tanner's recipe for success. His business, which is actually located on 6th and Chestnut Street, or kitty corner with Independence Hall today, if you wanted to go there, there's in the new building, insurance company I think is sitting there now, was an early example of a vertically integrated manufactory. Touring the business, the investigative reporter found on the building's first floor a showroom, followed by an extensive map library and the map drawing room where 3 draftsmen and engravers worked on preparing the twin materials necessary for creating each map, its original draft on paper and its mirror copy etched into copper. On the second floor, visitors would have walked past 4 printing presses using heavy copper plates and special map paper. Tanner's printing crew would have created around 500 maps per day, times 4 printing presses, so about 2,000 maps per day for total output in one printing run, basically. Before going on to the third floor, visitors would have ventured across a suite of rooms dedicated to map coloring, which in 1826 would have been a highly gendered profession. Throughout the 20s, city directories listed almost exclusively women working as map painters. On the third floor, we would have entered a flight of rooms where men and women worked together in the department called the bindery, where they assembled wall maps, atlases, and pocket maps. The last room, or rather station, in Tanner's Map Emporium were dedicated to the mounting and varnishing of maps, especially large ones like the Bowie map. And we were just talking earlier over lunch, that would have been a really smelly and disgusting task because it involves turpentine and chemicals. And if you're on the third floor in a Philadelphia townhouse in the summer, I would pass out just even thinking about that. So it would have been really hot and possibly dangerous. Unlike most of the competition, Tanner had mastered the map business by pairing craft and the intake of new information with pre-industrial efficiency. On the way out, back in the showroom, our investigative reporter was greeted by display copies representing Tanner's greatest hits, such as his best-selling National Atlas. Published in 1823, his New American Atlas was celebrated for its maps, not only because they were crisply delineated, but because they were constantly updated with new geographical information. Tanner had developed a special atlas binding designed so that owners could easily replace old maps with new ones. Every year, Tanner offered updated state maps that he sent out in blue paper wrappings as ready-made replacements. For Virginia customers, Tanner would have offered the map on the lower right as a signature version of the state. Other map works that Tanner was celebrated for was the way in which his company gave original maps a second or third life. Tanner's team of map binders explored different material formats for selling popular maps to audiences of different needs and financial backgrounds. Take, for example, Tanner's best-selling national map simply called United States. Large maps like this one were intended as wall displays. But to increase his customer base, Tanner sold the map in a dissected format, which after it was mounted on cotton backings, was folded into ornate case covers. Such case maps, as they're called, were the size of a book and thus designed for businesses or private libraries. The much smaller atlas maps, like the one of Ohio on the bottom of the slide, would be printed on banknote paper, think of it as sturdy tissue paper, and was then folded and partially glued into empty covers of a pocketbook the size of a modern postcard. Making the Bowie maps accessible and portable was probably the reason why in September 1827, less than a year after the map's original publication, the Virginia legislature commissioned a half-size version of the original giant. Using only 4 instead of 9 sheets of paper, measuring a total of 4 by 2.5 feet, this map was also engraved by the Tanner Company. If you look closely, you will see along the map's edges green silk ribbons, and peeking out from the cracks between the dissected sheets, you can also see the map's cotton backing. What we don't see is a flyleaf by which the map would have been glued into the covers of a pocketbook, like the sample on the lower left. Instead, the material construction of Bowie's reduced map of the state of Virginia suggests it was sold as a case map, to be boxed up in painted cardboard or leather casings, like the example on the lower right. I have never found actually a case that matches the Bowie map in this case. The act of downsizing the Bowie map came yet again at a significant cost. And I don't have to go into any more production details, but by now you all will have picked up on the fact that finances are a constant subtext in the biography of the Bowie maps. We know the original map was sponsored by state funds that, couched in the language of making presents and gift-giving, no one expected to recover. That this was the expectation we can see from the advertisement placed in the Richmond Enquirer, where ads like the one on the left announced the release of 250 copies to be sold at $20. By my math, selling 250 copies of the large map would have raised $5,000 and thus covered less than 10% of the original cost. A similar calculus seems to have informed the smaller version, sold for $6 per copy and in a convenient portable form. The sale of a full print run of 500 copies would only have raised $3,000. In both instances, this probably would have offset the engraving and printing costs charged by Tanner, but it would have not generated enough revenue to reimburse the state. But if you look at the advertisement to the right, what to some might have looked like a vanity project was definitely considered a major win of prestige by others. In 1829, the state of Pennsylvania, like many others before, had acquired copies of the Bowie map. The map was hung up in the Pennsylvania State House, where it staged Virginia's best cartographic image along with those of other states. In this, the Bowie map fulfilled the important symbolic work of underscoring Virginia's collective identity, similar to a coat of arms or a national flag, while also declaring the state's autonomy in relation to the Union. In view of these newspaper responses, when I further tried to reconstruct the afterlife of the Bowie maps and their overall impact, I'm struck by the following facts. If 1827 witnessed the first sales of Bowie's large and small map, the same year also marked the sudden end of the project. Tanner only printed 400 maps of the large one and 800 copies of the small map, which meant neither edition was ever in a position to become a bestseller like so many of Tanner's other products. When I probed the map archive for future references to Bowie's maps, I was surprised to find that neither the Tanner Publishing House nor that of his immediate successor, Samuel Augustus Mitchell, ever bothered to build on the amazingly detailed smaller map. Instead, during the 1830s and 40s, their catalogs recycled older maps first created by Tanner himself, which after several updates were reworked and continued by Mitchell without once mentioning the Bowie map ever. Shifting tack, when I tested the educational archive, I was equally interested to find that the Bowie map doesn't seem to have left a trace in school lessons on Virginia's geography. Since the 1790s, American schools and academies trained students of both sexes in map reading and map drawing. The outcomes were stunning productions like the embroidered map of Washington, D.C. on the top, the outline manuscript map of Virginia made by a schoolgirl in Vermont, or the one more generic public school exercise of stitching a map sampler, here the state of Pennsylvania. So far, I've not been able to locate comparable map exercises focused on Virginia that specialized in the art of mappery, as the school projects like these would have been called. I end my foray into the commercial world surrounding the Bowie maps with a quick glance forward. In 1859, some 30 years after the Virginia government invited visitors to examine the first copies of the map, the state's legislature requested yet again funds for another mapping project. This one, however, would not require a massive survey of the state. Rather, it paid tribute to Herman Bowie by requesting an update of his maps, meaning after over 30 years, the Bowie map was still considered as the gold standard of Virginia's cartographic representation. The task to update the map was taken up by Louis van Buchholz, who created a facsimile for both while adding new information. And then we now know he's using actually the original copper plates that I did not know initially. In scale, and that's explained then why in scale and size and look, the copies before you are nearly indistinguishable from the original maps. In terms of cultural significance, historical circumstances, however, would recreate an eerily different and much darker parallel. Like the Bowie maps, the updated copies had limited print runs and thus were a scarce commodity after the outbreak of the Civil War. Once again, we can imagine military missions hampered by the lack of cartographic information. Considered to be the most accurate map of Virginia, both the Bowie and the Buchholz editions would have been sought eagerly by friend and foe to navigate the state's terrain. We don't know who had owned the smaller map on the right, but a closer look reveals that its annotations appear to follow the movements of the Army of the Confederate States during the Gettysburg Campaign in June and July of 1863. It is map marginalia like these that breathe life into map history. If the map was truly sought out by the military during the war years, it certainly would explain today's scarcity of the map. There are less than a dozen copies of the Bowie maps that I'm aware of. Thanks to the Library of Virginia and the current exhibition and today's events, They help us to better understand the cultural history of maps in general, and then the significance of the Bowie map in particular. I look forward to what we'll find next. Thank you.
Questions?
What did you use for your cost escalators, where you showed the price of something when it's first sold as now? What was
I
it?
used the link measuringsworth.com.
What's it called?
Measuringsworth.com.
Okay.
It's a very, I mean, you have to understand, you have to crack the code on how they assign value, but it's a very useful tool to figure this out. Yeah. And you can only go up to the year before the current year. So you can't do for 2025, but you can get the worth or the value for 2024.
Did you mention how big the Tanner firm was, how many people they employed? Because I see the various state maps that were engraved by Tanner, and then you talk about Tanner's own production itself. So it was
Mr.
probably
Tanner,
just more than Henry Tanner.
exactly. So this is kind of one of these moments when you realize every time it's signed, H.S. Tanner is the engraver. There is a stable of people behind him who is helping with the engraving activities. So we know at least, and he inherited this model from John Mellish, who also we know had at least 3 or 4 engravers on staff on his payrolls who worked with him on various different maps. So Tanner also had at least 3 or 4 engravers, plus himself, plus his brother. I mean, his brother Benjamin also worked with the maps, not just in illustrations. So this is one of the myths, right? That this one engraver heroically just day and night just produces all these maps.
I'm kind of driving home now. The steel plate engraving, which I think Colton started in about 36.
Yeah, in the late 30s, yes, correct.
And
yeah.
would that have affected I'm guessing that would have affected the profitability of printers.
Yeah, so this is a really helpful question. So our copper plates, you can only, and this is something I skipped in my talk because I felt like this would get me down a rabbit hole. So you can pull one clean print, in terms of get clean copies of a copper plate, you can do a maximum of 500 copies per pull. So that means after that, your copper plate had to go back downstairs in the Tanner firm and get re-engraved to yet again have these crisp kind of lines that everybody really kind of celebrated. People were really in awe of the workmanship that went into the engravings. Steel plates allowed you to pull 1,000 copies. And then lithography kicks in within another 5 years. By the mid-40s, you have lithographic stone as like your starting place for map engravings. And then it's like 10,000 copies a day. So the Tanner basically was still riding the tail of high-end copper plate printing, but that was, in his own lifetime, he was superseded by basically lithography, and that was actually the end of his firm. Yeah. He didn't modernize. There's another way of saying this, yeah.
So would you say, the end of the copper plate era is the 1820s, and so steel plates take over
Mid-30s.
Mid-30s?
But then steel plates get superseded very quickly by lithography.
by lithography?
Yeah, and then then we have stereoscopic, they have stereographic printing after the Civil War, basically, yeah.
And yet, still, the Commonwealth of Virginia decided to have the second state printed from copper plates
So
in
that-
1859.
So then you could argue this, again, that's why they follow the money, right? So is it
Yeah.
a question of the state just didn't want to invest in somebody re-engraving something brand new? And they didn't know lithography was on the horizon, right? That's the other thing. I mean, who would have guessed that there would be such a thing like GPS?
Are there any other? Yes, here you go.
Well, this has all been quite interesting. And so the question I'm going to ask kind of goes outside the bounds of this. But the Land Survey Act that Jefferson, I guess, was lead in.
1785, you mean the Ordnance Act?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It seems to me that there's a correlation between the complexity of the colonial maps and the need looking far ahead for the Land Survey Act, creating a much simpler system.
Yes.
So I don't know if
I mean, you're looking at a room full of people who probably know more about this than me, but from what my reading is, the moment we have the Land Ordnance Act in play, which gets re-upped for the Northwest Ordinance in 1787, And that basically just mandates the cadastral survey, the rectangular grid survey for anything west of the original 13 colonies. And when you read the ordinance itself, it's fascinating what they really want to get out of it. They want to, set aside public lands. They set aside federally mandated land for public education, in which today the state colleges, for example, like Penn State is sitting on the land grant that came out of that act, even though they were within the 13 original states. And they made all kinds of other provisions, and then of course the logic being it's meant to be surveyed according to a certain kind of scale, et cetera, et cetera. They didn't specify like what Ron was demonstrating, right? How map makers decided on, well, these are the detailed information categories that we want to go into, whether it's mills versus taverns versus whatever. The Ordinance Act does not specify that. That's not part of their thinking. So later on maps actually, and this is interesting, I felt I looked at maps from Michigan, like the very first Michigan maps, like 1830s plus, 37 plus. They're actually really empty, in terms of information. And at first I thought it was just a matter of like the surveyors just there was nothing to survey and therefore record. Or their instructions were just such that all they really had to do is do the property lines and the most basic topographical features.
I recall reading a book about that survey and how they keep the straight lines. They had to go through swamps.
Oh, yeah.
Because of what, it was a very tedious task
Yes.
to do it, but it was very, very much a foresight on the part of Jefferson and the people who knew that to make
I kept thinking of William Byrd's History of the Dividing Line, the famous, and that was the first big survey of the Dismal Swamp, right? And he and his crew had to just plow through, and they managed to get a straight line out of it. But then I was talking to someone from Michigan earlier. So in Western Michigan, where my in-laws live, there's these two roads that meet and then jog because the two surveyors from two different directions missed each other. And this is, if you go like a north-south line, for like 10 miles total, like 5 miles north and south of this place that I know, all the roads have this weird jog because whoever was the surveyor just, the two teams just didn't use the same math, basically, or didn't do the same readings. And everybody now has to do the little S-curve as they drive to go shopping,
Okay, some of those jogs were not mistakes.
Oh,
They
thank
were
God.
like every 5 tiers of townships, they would have to make an adjustment for latitude.
Thank you. That explains it. So I'm no longer blaming faulty surveying, but it was just...
Okay, and most of the surveyors who were involved in the General Land Office system would record what they saw just along the line of survey.
There you go.
So when you get finished with the township plats, and let's say the commercial publisher comes along and wants to publish the map, they have to fill in the links between those things that are along the survey lines.
And since you mentioned the General Land Office, that's something, as you may all know, but this was not really around until the War of 1812. It was founded in 1812, realizing, oh my gosh, we have not enough cartographic information about our own country. And what I find fascinating in my research is that John Mellish, the predecessor to Henry Tanner, and then Tanner, they had like this direct line to the General Land Office. And actually it was often the reverse flow. The General Land Office came to them, can you give us the data that you already collected through your networks? Because they had folks out handing out questionnaires, or they had local surveyors just constantly updating them with information. That's why Tanner could really claim that his maps are really truly up to date, given whatever one can consider up to date at this point. Yeah. It's a fascinating moment of data storage and data transfer, because today it's the other way around, right? Today you beg the government to share.
Thank you for coming. Appreciate it.